I now want to talk to you about the procession of martyrs, mosaics, in Sant Apollinare Nuovo. You can see here, in this picture, we're standing in the one of the side aisles looking across the nave, and we're seeing the procession of the female martyrs as they go completely down the nave, above the arcade and below the clerestory, as though they were processing in the direction of the altar. Now, along the nave walls, there are processions of the martyrs in mosaics. On the north side, which would be the left side as you face the apse is usually in the east side, the east end, you have female martyrs. And they are shown as though they are processing from the Port of Classe, which is the end that is nearest to the entrance to the church of Sant Apollinare Nuovo, at the western end, toward a enthroned Virgin and Child, which is placed on the end of the nave nearest the apse. On the south side, or the right side as you face the apse, the male martyrs are processing, and they are starting nearer the west end at the palace of Theodoric, which will be a kind of interesting thing to talk about, and they process to Christ enthroned. So the females are processing, as it were, to the Virgin, of course the Virgin and Child, and the males are going to Christ, the adult enthroned. Now, who created these? Were they created under the Arians, or were they created after the Byzantine conquest of Ravenna and the Orthodox rededication of the church? And some people say, oh, you know, they're so Byzantine, they must be Byzantine. However, when we look at them, we'll see that there are several clear alterations that had to have been made by the Orthodox. There would be no reason to alter them in these manners if the Arian mosaics did not already exist. So it's much more likely that these were created for the Arian cathedral, and then when it was taken over by the Orthodox, there were some alterations made. And here we're looking at the procession of the female martyrs. And here is a detail of the Port of Classe. It's the port city nearest Ravenna. I think it's about 3 miles from Ravenna. And you can see you have these ships picked out in golden tesserae. The backgrounds are always golden. I have to talk about that. And here we're looking at some of the female martyrs. You'll notice they're all very similar. They're dressed in almost identical clothing, but their heads tip different ways and turn different ways, so there's a little bit of variety. They are holding the crowns of their martyrdom, and occasionally you can identify a figure. For example, you'll see that one of these martyrs has a sheep or a lamb next to her. And that tells us that she is Saint Agnes, because the word Agnus in Latin means sheep or lamb, and so it's very close to her name. So the symbol of Saint Agnes is often a sheep or a lamb. You'll have noticed, of course, that sheep and lambs are used in different contexts to have different symbolic meanings. Between each of the martyrs, there is a palm tree, and palms are often seen as part of the Garden of Heaven, but also palms are also seen as a symbol of martyrdom. Martyrs sometimes carry palms in artistic representations. The maidens are graceful. There's the slight variations that gives them a kind of rhythm, but not rigidity. And you'll notice that they all are elongated figures. In other words, their heads are fairly small in relationship to their body, and they're tall and slender. And this is one of the characteristics that we often see in Byzantine art. So these figures are in what we can call a fully Byzantine style. This is early Byzantine art. It's early because it's 6th century. Other characteristics is greater abstraction shown by line and pattern. And so you have very linear outlines. The drapery folds are often defined as line, but there is a tremendous amount of pattern in the jewels and the decorations of the dresses, of the garment that wraps around them. And you can see that you have some contrasting colors that helps you be able to see these from the floor. Also, one of the things that they often do in Byzantine art is to put the names of the saint or the holy person so you can identify them. Because as you can see, except for those exceptions where the art of the martyr has an attribute, such as the Lamb of St. Agnes, how would we know who they are? I should mention the golden backgrounds. You'll see golden backgrounds made. Of course, these are all made out of glass. You have light reflecting off the glass to give you this feeling of heaven, shimmers. But the gold background suggests that this is a heavenly setting. It's a spiritual setting. And of course, we realize this is the procession of the martyrs in heaven. The female martyrs are processing toward the Madonna and Child enthroned with two angels on either side of them. And there's somebody else who seems to be leading the procession, and this is the three magi. So essentially, they become pilgrims, like the magi, coming to adore the Christ child. So let's take a look at these figures. Here you see the magi. Once again, you have decorative patterns. They seem to be striding forward, they're leaning forward, they're distinguished actually, which is really interesting at this early stage. You have the older man with the white beard, a young beardless man, and a person who's sort of in between with a dark beard. And there's a lot of pattern and decoration on their costumes. They're wearing these, I guess, spangled tights, which is intended to be very exotic. And they're carrying beautiful vessels. The first one is probably gold, and then the others would contain, frankincense and myrrh. Now, the Magi have appeared before in art, so let's compare to those images. We see in the catacomb of Priscilla the first known adoration of the Magi. And of course, it's a fresco, but presumably there have been some details that have been worn off. So we're really seeing almost a silhouette of the shapes, where you see an enthroned Madonna holding the Christ child. And then in almost identical poses with the legs apart, leaning forward, striding, we see the three Magi in a row. So the pose has been passed down for about 3 centuries to Sant Apollinare Nuovo. And you may remember looking at the Magi on the mosaics from the 5th century at Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. And we said it looked like they were carrying giant pizzas, so their gifts have become more specific at Sant Apollinare Nuovo, but they're still wearing this exotic costume with spangles and pattern and decoration and tights, which is undoubtedly intended to be to show some exotic person from the East, from the Far East. And here we'll look closely at the Madonna and Child. We have a clearly defined throne with a big poofy cushion, which is what you'll see Christ and Mary and throne figures sitting on in Byzantine art. And you have the bejeweled footrest with this kind of what we might think of as a reverse perspective, where the side of the footrest gets larger as it goes back rather than tapering into space. But remember, there has been no 15th century mathematical or linear perspective yet. That's far in the future. So this is how Byzantine art shows depth. So you have to accept the conventions of the time. And when you're looking though at the Madonna and Child, they seem curiously flattened. you have some space with the footrest, but then when you get to the figures, they are iconic. They're like icons, like images, rather than like living figures, with these very large staring eyes that they look out at you. We'll be talking about icons later and the meaning of some of this. And Christ, of course, is completely enclosed within the shape of the Virgin. Both the idea that she is the God-bearer, and also she is the throne of wisdom on which Christ, who is holy wisdom, sits. He's represented, he looks like a small child. He's not a baby, he's not got the big head, but you never do see, in Byzantine art, you never do see Christ looking like a baby or a toddler with a big head. He always looks like a diminutive adult because he has all of the wisdom of an adult. So Mary is the Queen of Heaven with her retinue of angels. When we're looking at the opposite side of the church, we see the palace of Theodoric. Well, how do you know that? Well, it says right there, Palatium. And remember, we know that this was Theodoric's palace that was adjacent to the church. So what you're seeing is a image of Ravenna. And you're seeing buildings behind the palace, but the palace really is representing Ravenna as one of the most important buildings. And it's labeled Palace, Palatium, so you know that it is indeed the palace. Now, this is where you see an alteration. It seems that originally, in these open spaces between the, where you have the, this is where you see the Byzantine or Orthodox alterations. Originally, there would have been images of Theodoric and his court along the arcade, along the arcade, underneath the arches. But they seem to have been replaced by, in the center where Theodoric would have been, just a solid wall of gold. And where the courtiers would be, they have taken out those mosaics and replaced them with draperies. Now, how do we know that? Look closely. This detail. There is an arm that goes across one of the columns. So presumably there was an Arian courtier there. And his arm extended out in front of the column. And when the Orthodox, the new Orthodox rule came in and had their artisans replace all of those Arian figures, the figures of the courtiers at a court that they didn't approve of, they left some of it. They left an arm, though, there as evidence that there once were figures. So presumably, this has to be original to the Arians, because why else would the palace of Theodoric be created? And you wouldn't need to change something if it wasn't there already. Now we're looking at the procession of the male martyrs. And they, as you can see, are going to a Christ enthroned between angels. Once again, the same things we said about Byzantine style, very linear. You might notice here the shading of the drapery has really gone almost completely to line. You know, you have line to represent the drapery folds rather than a series of darker and lighter rows of tesserae to make it seem as though they're three-dimensional. They look flat. They look linear. There is variety in some of the faces, and some of them have different shaped beards. Some of them have tonsors, and you know, slight differences in the poses. Here's one person sticking his knee out, as it were. And that gives you a little bit of variety, but at the same time you have the rhythm, the repetition of these forms. Once again, they're very careful to place the names of the martyred saints above. And I'm making out here the one in this particular picture that we see on the right is labeled San Vitale, or Saint Vitalis, and we'll see that there is a church dedicated to him in Ravenna. So the drapery folds, it seems like you have flat bodies, you just have lines, but the feet still suggest three-dimensionality. They seem to turn in space. There's a little bit of foreshortening in some of them. Interesting. And here, once again, we're comparing the style from the Arian baptistry and Sant Apollinare Nuovo. And these, because we are seeing saints wearing white garments, and you can see that the style is very similar to that in the Arian baptistry. So you could either have if it's not the same workman, it could be the same workshop traditions passed down to another generation of artists or artisans. And here we see Christ enthroned, the adult Christ enthroned with a similar throne. You've got the big poofy cushion, you have jewels decorating the throne. This is always how you see the thrones of Christ and Mary in Byzantine art, and presumably resembles the thrones of the Byzantine emperors. And he is flanked by two angels, and you'll notice all the flowers that grow on the ground before, and of course the golden mosaic that indicates that this is heaven in the back. Now, one of the interesting things about the Christ here, he is frontal, yet there is more believable space with these figures. There is more shading. You know, it's not just a line of tesserae, so that Christ seems to be more solid than the procession of the martyrs. And with his legs, there is the suggestion that these are indeed foreshortened. And we look at the feet of the angels and of Christ, and they do seem slightly foreshortened, so they're coming out at us. There even seems to be perhaps a suggestion with some of the angels of cast shadows, which certainly is very illusionistic. Now, once again, there's that question, you know, were these created with the Arians, or was whatever was there replaced with a Orthodox image of Christ? We don't know. But there is another change that indicates that it has to have been an Orthodox change. The very first martyr in the procession, the one who is nearest Christ, is distinct from the others. He wears a dark robe rather than the pure white garment. And he's labeled. He's labeled Saint Martin. And remember, Saint Martin of Tours was an anti-Arian bishop. So he would never be portrayed in an Arian church. He persecuted the Arians. So this figure, or at least a name change, and possibly a change in the garment, but certainly the name change has to have been done when the church was taken over from the Arians and renamed and rededicated to St. Martin of Tours. Incidentally, St. Martin was not a martyr. But here he is shown in, I guess you say, pride of place, closest to Christ. And undoubtedly, he's placed there because they wanted to rename the church and they wanted to have an image of St. Martin. And then we will end this with the blessing of Christ.